The photograph should have captured everything perfectly. The Miller family of Beacon Falls, Connecticut, arranged themselves on their front porch steps that crisp October morning in 1890. Father William stood tall in his Sunday coat, Mother Eleanor smoothed her dark dress, and their 3 children posed with the careful stillness that early cameras demanded. But when the glass plate was developed days later, only 4 figures appeared in the frame. Their youngest son, 8-year-old Thomas, had simply vanished from the image, leaving nothing but an empty space where he should have been standing. The photographer swore the boy was there during the exposure. The family remembered him fidgeting between his siblings, complaining about the bright morning sun. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Thomas Miller had become the first documented case of a phenomenon that would haunt families across New England for decades. A mystery so bizarre that newspapers would call it the phantom child epidemic, and scientists would struggle to explain how a living, breathing child could disappear from photographs while remaining visible to we dive deeper into this a comment telling us haunting tale. Drop everyone around him. Before, where you're watching from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. And make sure to subscribe because stories like Thomas Miller's rarely make it into history books, but they deserve to be remembered. The morning Thomas vanished from that family portrait, Beacon Falls was just another quiet mill town nestled in the Naugatuck River Valley. Smoke rose from factory chimneys. Church bells marked the hours, and families like the Millers lived simple lives dictated by the rhythm of industrial progress. Photography was still a marvel, expensive and rare, requiring families to save for months just to capture a single moment in time. When the Millers finally arranged for their portrait, it was meant to be a celebration, a record of their prosperity and unity. William Miller owned a small dry goods store on Main Street. Eleanor tended to their home and garden with the precision of a woman who understood that reputation mattered in small towns. Their eldest daughter, Margaret, 16, helped in the store and dreamed of marriage to the banker's son. Their middle child, 12-year-old Henry, showed promise as a scholar and spent his afternoons reading by the window. And Thomas, sweet-faced and curious, collected insects in glass jars and asked questions that often made adults uncomfortable. The photographer, a traveling professional named Cornelius Blackwood, had arrived in town with his heavy equipment and promises of perfect family memories. He set up his camera on the front porch, adjusting the lens with the careful attention of a man who understood that one mistake could ruin everything. The glass plates were expensive, the chemicals volatile, and the process unforgiving. Blackwood positioned the family with practiced efficiency. William stood behind Eleanor's chair, his hand resting on her shoulder. Margaret and Henry flanked their mother, their faces serious and still. Thomas was placed between his siblings, his small frame completing the composition. The exposure would take nearly 30 seconds, requiring everyone to remain perfectly motionless while the camera captured their images on the treated glass plate. But something went wrong. Not during the sitting, everyone agreed on that. Thomas stood where he was supposed to stand, breathed when he was supposed to breathe, held still when Blackwood counted down the seconds. Eleanor even remembered reaching over to straighten his collar halfway through the exposure, her maternal instinct overriding the photographer's instructions to remain motionless. When Blackwood developed the plate in his makeshift darkroom that evening, he stared at the result in disbelief. 4 clear figures emerged from the chemical bath, each face distinct, each detail sharp. But where Thomas should have been, only empty space remained. Not a blur, not a double exposure, not the ghostly outline that sometimes appeared when subjects moved during long exposures. Simply nothing, as if the boy had never existed at all. Blackwood knew his craft. He had been photographing families for over a decade, traveling from town to town with his equipment and his reputation for quality work. He had seen every type of mistake, every possible error that could occur during the delicate process of capturing light on glass. This was different. This defied everything he understood about the science of photography. He developed the plate again, thinking perhaps the chemicals had been contaminated or the timing miscalculated. The result remained the same. He checked his equipment, examined the glass for flaws, reviewed every step of his process. Everything was perfect except for the impossible absence where Thomas Miller should have been standing. The next morning, Blackwood knocked on the Miller family door with trembling hands. He had spent the night pacing his hotel room, trying to understand what had happened, preparing explanations that sounded reasonable even to himself. When Eleanor Miller opened the door and saw his pale, worried expression, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The family gathered around the kitchen table as Blackwood unwrapped the developed photograph with the careful movements of a man handling explosives. He placed it in the center of the table, stepped back, and watched their faces change from anticipation to confusion to something approaching horror. Thomas was gone. Not faded, not blurred, not shifted to one side. Gone, as if he had never been part of the family at all. The space where he should have been standing created an unsettling gap in the composition, making the remaining family members appear oddly isolated despite standing close together. Eleanor Miller's first instinct was denial. She insisted that Blackwood had made a mistake, that he had somehow used the wrong plate or mixed up their photograph with another family's. But ASDC details that proved this was indeed their portrait. William, she studied the image more carefully, Sheikah's distinctive pocket watch chain, her own cameo brooch, Margaret's carefully braided hair, Henry's new shoes, all exactly as they had been arranged on the porch that morning. William Miller, a practical man who trusted in facts and evidence, examined the photograph with the methodical attention he applied to his business ledgers. He looked for signs of tampering, for evidence that the image had been altered somehow. But the photograph appeared completely authentic in every detail except for the impossible absence of his youngest son. Margaret wept quietly, her hands covering her face. Henry stared at the empty space with the intense concentration of a boy trying to solve a puzzle that had no logical solution. Thomas himself, very much alive and present in the kitchen, looked at the photograph with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child witnessing magic. Blackwood explained the technical impossibility of what they were seeing. Light could not simply ignore a human form. Chemical processes could not selectively erase one person while perfectly preserving everything around them. The laws of physics, as understood in 1890, made Thomas Miller's photographic disappearance absolutely impossible. Yet there it was, undeniable evidence that something beyond current understanding had occurred during that 30-second exposure on the Miller family porch. The photograph would become the first documented case in what newspapers would soon call the phantom child phenomenon, a mystery that would spread across New England like a strange epidemic, leaving families staring at portraits of children who existed everywhere except in the images meant to preserve their memory forever. Word of the Miller photograph spread through Beacon Falls with the speed that only truly shocking news can achieve. By evening, neighbors were knocking on the family's door, asking to see the impossible image for themselves. By the end of the week, curiosity seekers were arriving from neighboring towns, drawn by rumors of supernatural photography and scientific impossibilities. Dr. Ephraim Hartwell arrived in Beacon Falls on a Tuesday morning in November, carrying a leather satchel filled with scientific instruments and an unshakable belief that every mystery had a rational explanation. As professor of natural philosophy at Yale College, he had built his reputation debunking spiritualists and exposing fraudulent mediums. The Miller photograph represented exactly the kind of superstitious nonsense he made his career dismantling. Hartwell set up his equipment in the Miller parlor with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a puzzle he couldn't solve. His collection included magnifying glasses, chemical testing strips, measuring devices, and a portable microscope that he had imported from Germany specifically for examining photographic evidence. He studied the glass plate under intense magnification, searching for scratches, alterations, or chemical inconsistencies that would reveal the hoax. What he found instead challenged every assumption he had made about the case. The photograph showed no signs of tampering. The glass plate was perfectly intact, the chemical coating evenly distributed, the exposure time consistent across the entire image. Under magnification, he could see individual threads in the family's clothing, tiny imperfections in the wooden porch boards, even dust particles suspended in the air during the exposure. Everything was precisely as it should be, except for the empty space where Thomas Miller should have been standing. Hartwell interviewed the family separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. Eleanor Miller described how she had fussed with Thomas's collar during the exposure, her maternal instincts overriding the photographer's instructions to remain still. William Miller remembered his son shifting his weight from foot to foot, a nervous habit that had annoyed him during the long exposure. Margaret recalled Thomas whispering a complaint about the bright sun making his eyes water. Henry remembered stepping slightly away from his brother when Thomas had started to fidget. The details were consistent, specific, and impossible to fabricate. More importantly, they described a child who was undeniably present during the photograph, interacting with his family in ways that would have been visible to everyone present. Yet the developed image showed no trace of his existence. Blackwood, the photographer, submitted to Hartwell's questioning with the weariness of a man whose professional reputation hung in the balance. He demonstrated his development process, allowed Hartwell to examine his equipment, and provided detailed explanations of every chemical and technique involved in his work. His methods were sound, his equipment properly maintained, his expertise beyond question. On his third day in Beacon Falls, Hartwell made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his career. While examining the photograph under his most powerful magnifying glass, he noticed something that had escaped previous observation. The shadows cast by the Miller family members were perfectly positioned and proportioned, falling exactly as they should given the angle of the morning sun. But there was an additional shadow, faint but unmistakable, cast by something that wasn't visible in the photograph itself. The shadow fell precisely where Thomas Miller should have been standing. It was the right size, the right shape, the right density for an 8-year-old boy. The light had interacted with Thomas's physical form exactly as it should have, creating the shadow that proved his presence during the exposure. Yet somehow, the boy himself had failed to register on the photographic plate. Hartwell spent hours staring at that shadow, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he understood about light, chemistry, and the physical world. Light could not create shadows without an object to block it. Chemical processes could not selectively ignore certain forms of reflected light while perfectly capturing others from the same source. The shadow was proof that Thomas had been there, standing exactly where his family remembered him standing, interacting with light in all the ways that should have created his image on the glass plate. The professor packed his equipment that evening with hands that trembled despite his efforts to maintain scientific composure. He had come to Beacon Falls expecting to expose a clever hoax or explain a simple mistake. Instead, he was leaving with evidence of something that challenged the fundamental principles of natural philosophy. His official report, published in the Journal of Scientific Inquiry 3 months later, was a masterpiece of academic restraint. Hartwell described his methodology, detailed his findings, and presented his conclusions with the careful language of a man who knew his reputation depended on appearing rational. But between the lines, those who knew how to read academic prose could detect something else. Fear, perhaps, or the intellectual vertigo that comes from discovering that the world operates according to rules you don't understand. The report attracted attention from universities across New England. Other professors arrived in Beacon Falls to conduct their own investigations, each confident that they could succeed where Hartwell had failed. They brought more sophisticated equipment, more refined techniques, more advanced theories about light and chemical processes. One by one, they left town with the same bewildered expressions and the same reluctant conclusions. Thomas Miller, meanwhile, lived his life with the strange distinction of being the only child in Connecticut who could prove he didn't exist. The novelty wore thin quickly. Neighbors stared at him with expressions that mixed curiosity with unease. Other children avoided him, unsure whether his condition might be contagious. Even his own family began treating him differently, as if his photographic absence had somehow made him less real in their daily lives. The boy himself seemed remarkably untroubled by the attention. He continued collecting insects, asking uncomfortable questions, and displaying the cheerful resilience that 8-year-olds possess in abundance. But Eleanor Miller noticed changes in her youngest son that worried her more than any supernatural explanation ever could. Thomas had begun spending hours staring at mirrors, as if checking to confirm his own reflection. He asked repeatedly whether his family could still see him, whether he was really there, whether he might disappear completely one day. The psychological toll of being the phantom child was becoming evident, and Eleanor Miller began to understand that some mysteries extracted a price that went far beyond scientific curiosity or newspaper headlines. Her son was starting to doubt his own existence, and no amount of maternal reassurance seemed capable of counteracting the evidence of that impossible photograph. As winter settled over Beacon Falls, the Miller family learned to live with their strange burden. The photograph sat in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, too disturbing to display, but too important to destroy. Visitors still came occasionally, drawn by rumors and scientific curiosity, but the novelty was fading as other mysteries captured public attention. What they didn't know was that Thomas Miller's case was just the beginning. Across New England, other families were about to discover that their children could vanish from photographs while remaining perfectly visible to everyone around them. The phantom child phenomenon was spreading, and no one could explain why. The first reports arrived in December, carried by telegraph wires that hummed with impossible news. The Hartford Courant received a letter from a distraught mother in New Haven, whose daughter had disappeared from their Christmas portrait. The Springfield Republican published an account from a family in Northampton, whose twin boys had both vanished from the same photograph, leaving their parents standing alone beside empty chairs. By January 1891, similar cases were being reported from Maine to Rhode Island, each one following the same inexplicable pattern. Children present during the exposure, visible to everyone in the room, interacting normally with their families and surroundings. Yet, when the glass plates were developed, only empty spaces remained where young faces should have smiled back at the camera. The phenomenon showed no preference for age, gender, or social class. It struck wealthy merchant families and poor mill workers with equal indifference. The only common thread was that the missing children were always the youngest in their families, always under the age of 12, and always completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred. Dr. Cornelius Marsh, chief medical officer for the state of Connecticut, found himself tasked with investigating what officials were calling a public health emergency. The reports were too numerous and too consistent to dismiss as isolated hoaxes or mass hysteria. Something was affecting children across New England, and the medical establishment demanded answers that no one seemed able to provide. Marsh established his headquarters in Hartford, converting an entire floor of the state capitol building into a research facility dedicated to studying the phantom child phenomenon. He assembled a team that included photographers, chemists, physicians, and even a few reluctant theologued into service Winnaians who had been press's scientific explanations proved inadequate. The doctor's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While cataloging the reported cases, His assistant noticed that every affected family had purchased their photographic session from one of 7 traveling photographers who worked the New England circuit. These men moved from town to town with their heavy equipment and promises of perfect family memories, following routes that had remained unchanged for years. The connection seemed promising until Marsh's team tracked down all 7 photographers. 3 had died of natural causes before the phenomenon began. 2 had retired and moved west, their equipment sold or abandoned. 1 had suffered a nervous breakdown and was confined to an asylum in Boston, babbling about shadows that moved without bodies and children who existed only in the spaces between light and darkness. That left Cornelius Blackwood, the man who had first documented Thomas Miller's disappearance. Blackwood had continued working despite the growing controversy surrounding his profession, but his demeanor had changed dramatically since that October morning in Beacon Falls. Colleagues described him as increasingly agitated, prone to lengthy conversations with himself, and obsessed with examining his developed plates under magnification for hours at a time. When Marsh's investigators finally located Blackwood in a boarding house in Providence, they found a man on the edge of complete psychological collapse. His room was filled with dozens of photographs, all showing families with empty spaces where children should have been. He had arranged them on every surface, creating a gallery of absence that seemed to mock the very purpose of photography. Blackwood agreed to an interview, but his responses raised more questions than they answered. He claimed that he had begun seeing the children differently sometime in late 1889, describing them as appearing translucent or insubstantial during photographic sessions. The effect was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it had grown stronger over time until entire children seemed to flicker in and out of visibility like candle flames in a draft. The photographer insisted that his equipment was working perfectly, that his chemicals were properly mixed, that his techniques remained unchanged from years of successful practice. But something fundamental had shifted in the way light interacted with certain children during the photographic process. He couldn't explain what or why, only that the phenomenon was spreading and seemed to be accelerating. Marsh documented Blackwood's claims with the careful attention of a scientist studying a fascinating specimen, but privately he suspected that prolonged exposure to photographic chemicals had damaged the man's mind. Mercury, poisoning from the development process, could cause hallucinations and paranoid delusions. Silver nitrate exposure could affect vision and perception. The photographer's condition, while tragic, offered no real insight into the mystery of the vanishing children. The investigation might have stalled there, dismissed as mass hysteria, triggered by an unstable photographer's influence, if not for what happened next. On February 14, 1891, Dr. Marsh received an urgent telegram from his colleague Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell in Boston. She had been conducting her own research into the phenomenon when her 6-year-old nephew disappeared from a family Valentine portrait taken in her own parlor. Dr. Hartwell was the younger sister of Professor Ephraim Hartwell, the Yale scientist who had first investigated the Miller case. Unlike her brother, she approached the mystery from a medical rather than purely physical science perspective, focusing on the affected children rather than the photographic process itself. Her nephew's disappearance provided her with a test subject she could observe continuously, and what she discovered changed everything. Young Timothy Hartwell had not simply vanished from the photograph and returned to normal life. In the days following his photographic disappearance, subtle changes began manifesting in his behavior and physical presence. He seemed to occupy space differently, moving through rooms as if he weighed slightly less than he should. Shadows fell differently around him, shorter and less distinct than those cast by other people in the same light. Most disturbingly, mirrors began reflecting his image with a slight delay, as if the light carrying his reflection had to travel farther than it should. Dr. Hartwell documented these changes with the meticulous attention of a physician studying a new disease. She measured Timothy's weight, height, and vital signs daily, finding subtle but consistent variations that couldn't be explained by normal growth patterns or measurement error. His pulse seemed fainter, his breathing shallower, his body temperature consistently lower than it should have been. The boy himself remained cheerful and apparently healthy, showing no signs of illness or distress. But his aunt noticed that he had begun asking strange questions about whether he was really there, whether other people could see him properly, whether he might disappear entirely one day. The psychological pattern was identical to what the Miller family had observed in Thomas, suggesting that the affected children possessed some instinctive awareness of their changing condition. Dr. Hartwell's findings reached Dr. Marsh just as similar reports began arriving from other families with phantom children. Parents across New England were writing desperate letters describing the same subtle changes in their vanished offspring. Children who seemed less solid, less present, less anchored to the physical world, despite remaining visible and apparently normal to casual observation. The medical implications were staggering. If the phantom children were indeed undergoing some form of physical transformation, then the photographic phenomenon was merely the first visible symptom of a condition that affected their entire existence. The question was no longer why children disappeared from photographs, but what was happening to them after they vanished and whether the process could be stopped or reversed. Dr. Marsh expanded his investigation to include detailed medical examinations of every reported phantom child. His team traveled across New England, conducting physical assessments, psychological evaluations, and experimental tests designed to measure the children's interaction with light, heat, and other forms of energy. The results painted a disturbing picture of young lives gradually becoming untethered from the physical world. Every phantom child showed the same progression of symptoms. First came the photographic disappearance, followed by subtle changes in weight and physical presence. Their shadows grew fainter over time, their reflections more delayed and indistinct. They began requiring less food, less sleep, less of everything that normal children needed to maintain their existence. Some parents reported that their phantom children felt cooler to the touch, as if their bodies were slowly losing the ability to generate or retain heat. Most troubling of all was the psychological impact on the affected families. Parents found themselves constantly checking to ensure their phantom children were still visible, still present, still real. Siblings avoided their transformed brothers and sisters, unsure whether the condition might spread through contact or proximity. The phantom children themselves began withdrawing from normal childhood activities, as if instinctively preparing for a complete disappearance that seemed increasingly inevitable. By spring of 1891, Dr. Marsh had documented 47 cases of phantom children across 6 states. The phenomenon showed no signs of slowing down, and the affected children were displaying increasingly severe symptoms as time passed. Some had become so insubstantial that they could barely cast shadows at all, their presence detectable only by the slight displacement of air when they moved through rooms. The medical establishment was baffled, the scientific community divided, and the public increasingly panicked. Families began avoiding photographers entirely, afraid that the very act of having their portraits taken might trigger the mysterious transformation in their own children. Photography studios closed. Traveling photographers found themselves unwelcome in towns across New England, and an entire profession fell under suspicion of somehow causing the inexplicable phenomenon. But the phantom children continued to fade, growing more translucent and ethereal with each passing week, while their desperate families watched helplessly as their youngest members slowly dissolved from the world around them. The mystery that had begun with Thomas Miller's missing image was evolving into something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The summer of 1891 brought no relief to the families watching their children slip away. Dr. Marsh's research facility had become a desperate sanctuary, where parents arrived with increasingly translucent offspring, begging for answers that science couldn't provide. The phantom children wandered the Hartford corridors like living ghosts, their footsteps making barely audible whispers against the polished floors. Thomas Miller returned to the facility in June, accompanied by his mother Eleanor, whose face had aged years in the months since that first impossible photograph. The boy, who had once collected insects with boundless curiosity, now moved through the world with the careful deliberation of someone testing whether each step would find solid ground. His voice had grown softer, requiring listeners to lean close to catch his words, as if sound itself struggled to carry his speech across normal distances. Dr. Marsh examined Thomas with instruments designed to measure the unmeasurable. Light meters registered peculiar readings when directed at the boy, fluctuating in ways that defied calibration. Temperature sensors detected cold spots that followed him through rooms, as though he carried winter in his wake. Most disturbing of all, the scales could no longer provide consistent readings of his weight, the numbers shifting and wavering as if Thomas existed in a state of constant flux between presence and absence. The medical team had developed a classification system for the phenomenon, dividing the progression into stages that marked each child's journey toward complete dissolution. Stage 1, children had vanished from photographs but remained otherwise normal. Stage 2 showed the subtle physical changes that Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had first documented in her nephew. Stage 3 brought the dramatic reduction in physical presence that made the children appear ghost-like even to direct observation. Thomas Miller had advanced to Stage 4. At this level, the phantom children cast no shadows whatsoever. Their reflections appeared only sporadically in mirrors, and their voices often failed to register on the recording devices that Dr. Marsh used to document interviews. They required almost no food or water, existing on reserves that seemed drawn from some source beyond normal biological processes. Their families could still see them, still touch them, but the contact felt increasingly insubstantial, like embracing morning mist. The psychological toll on the phantom children had become as severe as their physical transformation. They spoke frequently of feeling disconnected from the world around them, of watching life happen as if through thick glass. Many had stopped playing with toys or engaging in childhood activities, claiming that objects felt strange in their hands, too solid and real for their diminished touch. They gathered together when possible, finding comfort in the company of others who shared their impossible condition. Dr. Marsh observed these gatherings with growing unease. When phantom children stood near each other, their translucent forms seemed to gain definition, becoming more visible and present through proximity to their transformed peers. They communicated in whispers and glances, sharing experiences that normal children couldn't understand. Sometimes they would all turn their heads simultaneously, as if hearing sounds that existed beyond the range of ordinary perception. The phenomenon had spread beyond New England, carried by families fleeing the region in desperate hope that distance might break whatever curse had claimed their children. Reports arrived from as far west as Ohio and as far south as Virginia, each describing the same progression from photographic absence to gradual dissolution from reality itself. The phantom children were epidemic with no known cause, treatment becoming a nationwide or cure. Religious leaders proclaimed the phenomenon divine judgment, punishment for society's embrace of modern technology that captured souls along with images. Scientists proposed theories involving electromagnetic disturbances, chemical contamination, and mass psychological contagion. Spiritualists claimed the children were being called to join the realm of spirits, selected for their innocence and purity. None of these explanations offered practical solutions to families watching their youngest members fade from existence. Dr. Marsh had begun experiencing his own disturbing symptoms. After months of close contact with phantom children, he noticed that his own reflection occasionally flickered in mirrors. that his shadow seemed less distinct during certain times of day. The possibility that the condition might spread to adults who spent prolonged time with affected children added new urgency to his research, even as it raised questions about whether he remained objective enough to continue his investigation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Catherine Wells, a seamstress from Portland, Maine, arrived at the Hartford facility with her 7-year-old daughter Sarah, who had reached stage 4 of the phantom progression. But Mrs. Wells brought something no other family had provided: a detailed record of every photograph taken of Sarah since birth, including several images captured before the phenomenon began. Examining these earlier photographs under high magnification, Dr. Marsh made a discovery that sent shivers through his research team. In photographs taken as early as 1888, 2 years before the phantom phenomenon officially began, Sarah Wells appeared slightly different from her family members. Her image was subtly less defined, her edges softer, her presence somehow diminished compared to the sharp clarity of everyone else in the frame. This suggested that the transformation didn't begin with the complete photographic disappearance that families noticed. Instead, it represented the culmination of a process that had been building gradually over years, so subtle in its early stages that no one recognized what was happening until children began vanishing entirely from family portraits. The phantom children of New England remain one of history's most haunting mysteries, a reminder that our world holds secrets that science cannot always explain. Thomas Miller and the 47 other documented cases challenge everything we think we know about existence itself. Their gradual fade from reality left families forever changed and questions that echo through time.